Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to the Lifetime Training Talks podcast. And today we are going into program design. And I don't know if I have a better person to talk about program design than Mr. Stephane Cazeault, who's been 25 years perfecting his craft, has some of the biggest influences, smartest minds in the world he's studied directly under for many, many years. And I'll let him go into that. And, written books, trained professional athletes. I mean, welcome to the show, Stephane.
Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Sweet, man. Well, I think it's great. The purpose of this podcast, one of them is to really expose some of the best in the world educators that have spent, their lifetimes not only learning the craft, but educating. And, you're one of them. And there might not be a lot of people that know who you are and kind of who your influences were. So I would love for you to just start by, sharing your story and your influences. And then we'll dive into some, tricks and trades around program design.
Yeah. I'm born in Quebec, Canada. So like the French speaking part of Canada. And I started lifting, I was 11. And, back then, so I'm 44 now, I'm born in 77. So we're talking about 88 when I started lifting. So to me, right away, it was like the whole, the action heroes from the 80s television, right? Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Lundgren, Jean-Claude Van Damme, all these guys were kind of like, I was so intrigued. So I'm like, I want to start lifting. I want to start looking like these guys. So I started buying books at 11. I had this like Italian bodybuilding book translated in French. That was my first influence. Then like many of us, I bought the whole Arnold Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. So I kind of started doing these workouts, which were like 2 hours long and all that stuff. And then it kind of, bodybuilding was kind of like my first love. But I did a lot of martial arts, and I played American football. I was a running back. So naturally, my training kind of evolved more towards performance. And I always remember I was 14. On a Saturday morning, I was watching This Is the NFL, hosted by Steve Sable. And they were doing this piece on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers' new training facility. And they were showing like the weight room and the strength coaches. And right there, I was so intrigued. I'm like, I want to be a strength coach. Like from that age, I kind of knew I wanted to do that. So every step I took, education-wise, was in function of this. So in 1997, I went to University of Montreal in exercise science, and I did my bachelor's degree, graduated in 2000. But in the meanwhile, like in 95, I remember reading Muscle Media 2000, which was like a new bodybuilding magazine.
Yes, right. It was owned by Bill Phillips.
Bill Phillips. And so it was kind of intriguing to me because there was this writer who wrote about training so differently. Like before that, it was like 3x10, whatever. Now you had this guy, Charles Poliquin, writing like training articles with A1, A2, very descriptive name of exercises, 3-digit tempos back then, rest periods. I was super intrigued. And once so I started reading more and more about him. And then in 98, every Friday afternoon, T Nation, which was a Colorado-based web, web article-based website, it came out, and then Charles was writing for them as well. So that was during my bachelor's degree. So I started training in a commercial gym in May 1999. It was this big commercial gym in Montreal, one of those high-end places with racquetball court, indoor, outdoor pool, basketball court, the whole thing. And we're 35 trainers. I was the youngest trainer at the time. So what I liked about it is you had to fight to get your clients, And by fight, I mean you really had to do your own work to get clients. So that was very formative for me at that time. And then in 2000, once I graduated, I started doing continuing education, which did not really exist much at the time. You had Paul Chek, you had Charles Poliquin, you had Ian King from Australia, Charlie Francis, Eric Serrano, and John Berardi was just starting out. So I did a lot of these. And, like young, early 20s, So you're learning from all these guys. So at one point, like I realized that Charles Poliquin was the one where I connected the most with, maybe because of the scientific and meticulous input that he brought to the strength training game. So I started doing more and more continuing education with him. So in 2001, I went to his first ever biosig in Chicago. I booked a 2-hour private consult with him. And then then I was kind of hooked. I did his PICP 1 and 2 in 2004, which was before his entire education platform actually came about. So that was very interesting because it was a lot of IN coaches with a lot of experience already that did these courses. So you learned a lot. It was very hands-on. And then one of the guys teaching with him was Nelson Ayat, which used to be the Canadian biathlon strength coach. And he was very knowledgeable in the energy system training. And he worked with Charles in his center in Arizona. And in 2005, they wanted to open a center in St. Louis, and Nelson was going to be the head strength coach there. So he approached me and hired me to be a coach there in St. Louis at their IN facility. And you have to think about 2005. That was one of the first place like this you can find in the country where you had the strength coaches, you had chiropractors, we had IV with nurses and the whole thing. So it was like a one-stop stop for pro athletes and IN executives. So it was very, very interesting. From then on, it evolved. Nelson went on to get a job as the high performance director for the St. Louis Blues. Yep. So then I evolved into being the head guy there in St. Louis, trained more and more athletes. Started with NHL, then evolved to the NFL, then finally started training Major League Baseball guys. And what was very interesting is 2010, 2011, 2012, I was hired as a high performance consultant with the Cardinals. So I was kind of in charge of writing the programs for the pros, the farm teams. I had about 12 players that were personal clients of mine on the team. And then it was really, really cool to be part of the process when they won the World Series in 2011. Yeah. Then in 2012, Charles Poliquin approached me to go and work for him in Rhode Island for his business that had started out in 2008 officially. So I was in Rhode Island. So I moved to Rhode Island. And then I was my task there, I was the head strength coach, but I was also in charge of education. So it was very interesting working with a lot of top coaches, building up content, educational content, mostly for strength coaches, but it kind of evolved to personal training over the time. Then 2013, Charles left the company, went on his own, created Strength Sensei. And then January 2016, I resigned from Poliquin Group and decided to start my own company, Kilo Strength Society. And at the time I could decide where to go. So I decided to go in Southern California and open up in Huntington Beach, which is 40 minutes south of LA. Opened up the facility there, which was supposed to be group training only, but it kind of evolved like many businesses. Sometimes it changed to what you think it's going to be. And it evolved into being more of an education company. So as of 2 months ago, we actually moved to Miami to open up our new facility here because it made more sense for education, because a lot of our students are East Coast US, East Coast Canada, Europe. We also have Australian and the Hong Kong, Singapore market and all, but Miami was just more accessible. Obviously, commercial real estate a little cheaper than Southern Cal. So it just made sense for us. So we made the move, and we should be ready to open and host courses by October of this year.
Beautiful. Well, and for many of those out there that may not have heard of Charles Poliquin, obviously, he passed away a few years back, unfortunately. You're kind of the one of the main descendants of passing on and evolving, obviously, as we'll talk about, his information. One of the things I love, because it wasn't a Charles thing, but a similar path where I was in college, going to school for exercise phys, athletic trainer. But I also started educating myself in the training world and, got certified, whatever, while I was in college. I'd love your feedback, from, nowadays. I mean, college is here. Obviously I know my experience, but what was your experience, what you learned in college versus what you learned post, and how to handle that information? And is it a necessity necessarily to get the degree? I know it helps, and I'm not downgrading it, but I just love your opinion on that.
Yeah, that one's a tough one because, listen, obviously it's helpful, but I'm a little bit older than our average listeners, or the young coaches coming in. And the thing is, at the University of Montreal, and I think it was pretty much everywhere in North America at the time, most of the professors came from the 70s. And what was big in the 70s? Aerobic training. So a lot of our professors were aerobic guys. So it was interesting because as you graduate from exercise science, because I was not in phys ed or anything like that, but as you graduate from exercise science, what's one of the only job you can get? Personal trainer in a gym. But what do you do as a personal trainer? I'm not going to stand by the treadmill for an hour. No, you're in the weight room, right? Yeah. But in the entire bachelor's degree, I'm not kidding, we didn't spend more than 3 hours in the weight room. And the guy was explaining what a leg curl is, a adductor machine is, what the cam on a leg curl is, and that was pretty much it. It's not like the guy was going to teach us squatting and never done it a day in his life. Yeah. So it was kind of, it's almost like year one was the most valuable, because year one you learn anatomy, physiology, biomechanics, all those basic stuff. But the more you went through the years and the more it became specific to non-applicable concepts of what you can do in your work as a personal trainer. Like we learned about Matveyev periodization concept, like the 60s Russian periodization model. How good is that for me as a personal trainer working in a commercial gym with Gen Pop? Yeah. Not really. Now, I know that nowadays there are some curriculum in some universities with guys like that are much more in tune with strength training. There's more research behind it. There's more time spent on it. So I think a bachelor's degree now has a little bit more value. But that being said, I still feel that even nowadays, you learn more practical information outside of the bachelor's degree. Now, if you want to be an NCAA strength coach, you need to have a bachelor's degree. Exactly. Because you need to have your CSCS, and to have your CSCS, you need to have a bachelor's degree. So depending on what you want to do, you need to have your bachelor's degree. Yeah. For that, it does have value.
Yeah. And the thing too that I wanted to overemphasize is, how much money and time have you probably spent after college? Don't even count the dollars that you spent on college, right? After college to get to where you are and to have that success. And I think that's the message really is, how do you spend your time and how do you spend your money? And, those are two things that are so valuable, in people's lives. And, I know I've spent probably 60 to 80 grand after college, at least, on continuing education.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question, but you have to keep in mind I'm Canadian, so my college degree was like almost nothing.
Shoot. That's true.
A semester for me was like $900.
Oh man.
So,
Love
so
that.
I obviously spent a ton more post-university in continuing education. Like not only because I traveled for those, so it's not only the courses themselves, but it's the travel, the
for sure,
the food, all the private consult that I paid, and Charles was not necessarily the cheapest.
But that's the key, though, man. You did that. So many people don't do that, and what you can learn in an hour or two from Charles or somebody to that nature, it just will blow your mind. And
of course, and like education, no matter what, like it tailors to the average, right? The rule of the 80% rule. So it tailors to the average, but the outliers and stuff, you're going to learn way more once you dig into those one-on-one conversation. For sure.
Got it. Well, I always talk about program design, and, if you think that you've got it, and you think that you know everything, and then all of a sudden, like I said earlier, there's like 25 principles on just manipulating reps, and X amount for sets, and really, Charles and Poliquin, really, who Charles wrote Poliquin's program design manual, really a lot of that stems from. So with it gets confusing, and so many trainers want to train athletes, but their main source of income is not training athletes, it's the general pop. I'd love for us to kind of dive into the program design now, and kind of over the time and what you've learned from everybody that you've learned from. Would you talk about and almost list and rank order the variables within an exercise program that are the most important?
Yeah. So I mean, like you said, there's a lot behind it, and it's always more complex than what it seems. But uh, obviously, exercise selection is a very, very important variable. But exercise selection it's highly dependent on who you're training and their ability at the time, or even equipment availability as well. Like, for example, COVID was a huge example of the limiting factors of dealing with clients that have like one kettlebell. Uh, so exercise selection is one thing, but beyond that, to be honest, the rep is probably the most important parameter, because the rep dictates the intensity and the load of your training. So doing 2 reps, for example, doesn't yield the same training effect as doing 12 reps or 20 repetitions. So the rep is the first thing that you have to think about when you're writing your program. Then the second most important element will be the number of sets, because the number of sets combined with the reps will dictate the training volume of the training phase or the training program you're writing. So intensity is important, volume is also important, and then you need both to work together.
Now, when you talk about reps too, because so many people say, okay, 2 reps. So I've got a 10-pound kettlebell. I've been working out for 15 years, and I do 2 reps. And would you expand just a little bit about, when you say reps, what does that actually mean?
So there is it's called a 1RM continuum. So it's important to understand that in strength training, 1 rep equals 100% intensity. So 1 rep is the most intense rep that you can program. But this, we're assuming that if you're doing 1 rep, you're doing a 1 RM. So if you're doing 1 rep with a 50 RM, for example, then that 1 rep means nothing.
Okay? And when you say 50 RM, that's a weight that you can lift 50 times to failure.
Yes, exactly. 50 times to failure. Yeah. Now, typically in the world of strength training, 70% of 1 RM is the minimum intensity threshold in which you can gain strength and or mass, unless you're a full beginner. Yeah. So if you have like somebody who's never lifted, you can get away with training at 60% of 1 RM and still get results. But after typically 6 months to maybe a year, depending on the neural activity of the client, then you need to start lifting at above 70%. And 70% on that 1 RM continuum represents 12 repetitions. So what that means is your key exercise, your primary exercise, which are typically your multi-joint compound lifts, should always be trained anywhere from 1 to 12 if you want results, and 1 to 12 with load of 70% or more. So with your example, if you have a 10-pound kettlebell and you've been doing sets of 5 your entire life, but you've been doing this for 5 years, now that 10 pound does not represent 5 RM anymore, or 85%, which is what 5 reps is. It might only represent 50 or 40% of your maximum. So now to do 5 reps, it's like you're wasting your time, because you're so far away from momentary voluntary contraction, which is failure, that neurally speaking and biochemically speaking, there's nothing happening in terms of cellular change, in terms of mass and or strength gain. So that's why the rep, understanding that the rep is associated to an intensity, is very, very important to follow. And it's also very important to vary, because the rep is also the parameter at which you adapt to the quickest. So, we all know that guy that's been doing like sets of 10 for like 2.5 years. Yeah. Well, they've plateaued, they've maxed out their ability to create a response at that rep. So that's why a lot of the more modern periodization models you see have variation in reps to account for variations in intensity.
And if I'm correct in what I remember going through the basic PICP is the research said, and I don't know the strength age, how long somebody's been working. I forgot what that was, so I'd love for you to tell. But it was the body will adapt to a certain rep scheme within 2 weeks, I believe it is. Is that correct?
Yeah, it depends. Like on average, it's about 6 exposures.
Okay.
So if, let's say, you're doing one specific workout only once a week, so you can stay on that specific program for 6 weeks. But if you're one of those guys who does upper, lower, and your Monday upper and your Thursday upper are the exact same workouts, so after 3 weeks, which will be 6 exposures, then it's time to change. And now the more advanced you are, the faster the rate of change should be. Like some really advanced guys like throwers, for example, or bobsledders, they might change every 2 or 3 exposures.
Got it. And while we're on reps and while we're on what people would consider heavy weight, because I always say heavy weight is relative to the number of times you can lift it. If you can lift something 1,000 pounds 10 times, it's relatively not heavy compared to what you can lift once. So would you go into telling the audience the difference between what happens when you're lifting to failure at lower rep schemes versus lifting to failure at higher rep schemes? Because obviously there's a part of the audience that maybe they don't want to get bigger, or they're worried about getting bigger lifting heavy.
Yeah. So what happens is training to failure, it's quite important because what the lifter needs to understand is that a motor unit, so a muscle fiber or a muscle fiber complex that is recruited, is not necessarily trained. The only way you train a motor unit is if it's activated, but also fatigued, right? So if you always train short of failure, you might recruit some motor units, but you don't necessarily train them. Hence, you're not truly training, you're not truly improving. So if you're doing typically anywhere from 1 to 5 reps at your maximum ability, this will be anywhere from 85% to 100%. This typically falls into the strength quality called relative strength, which means that it's very, very demanding in the central nervous system. You're going to get a lot of strength component from it, but the sheer amount of volume is not high enough to truly elicit a biochemical change in the fibers in terms of increased muscle mass. Now, if you're a very, very fast twitch guy, which means that you have a high percentage of fast twitch fibers in your body, 5 reps might be enough to trigger some hypertrophy, but it's never going to be as substantial as if you're doing, let's say, 8 to 12 reps, where now the intensity is 70 to 78% of 1RM. And now what happens, assuming you're training to failure from 8 to 12, now you're creating enough rep volume to create that chemical reaction that's going to elicit the response in hypertrophy while not as much in strength. But it's never black and white. You're always going to get some strength from 1 to 12. You're always going to get some mass, but it's just that the emphasis will shift towards one side more than the other side because of that. So what happens is when you're recruiting, when you're doing, let's say, 5 reps, the load on that first rep, okay, the perceived load of that first rep is so high that you're going to start recruiting higher threshold motor units early. Okay, so the vast majority of your rep, you'll trigger higher threshold motor units. But if you're doing 12 reps, that first rep it's not that heavy, right? So at that point, there's no need to recruit high threshold motor unit. You're going to recruit slower twitch fibers, but the slow fibers, they have a lot of endurance. So you're activating it, recruiting it, but you're not fatiguing it, so you're not training it. So then you go to rep 2, same thing, rep 3, rep 4, rep 5, rep 6, rep 7. Now at rep 8 and stuff, like now it's started to get hard. So at that point, you're starting to recruit high threshold motor unit. But you need to get to that point to get the training effect. So that's why that training to failure has some importance in terms of your training effect.
Got it. And so again, what I'm hearing you say is that the lower the rep scheme to failure, the more is a neurological response, that an adaptation that's going to occur, which isn't going to cause potentially, again, I think this is also where some of the other variables start to come into play and how you're implementing those, but it's not going to cause you to get bigger. So would you talk about the other variables? So we talked about sets and reps, and obviously I think, there's some other ones that play a huge role in whether somebody gets big. Let's stay on the same kind of 5 rep max kind of concept.
Yeah, I mean, so the sets play a role again, like I was saying. So let's say you're doing 5 sets of 3 at 90%, or then you're doing, 5 sets of 10. Obviously, you're going to gain more mass with 5 sets of 10, not only because the rep is more applicable, but the total volume of rep is much higher. We're talking about 50 reps, 5 by 10, while we're talking about 15 reps, 5 by 3. But then it gets a little tricky at equal volume. So if you were to do 10 sets of 3 at 30 reps instead of 3 sets of 10 at 30 reps, then it gets a little grayer, because now, although the 3 rep is not a hypertrophy rep, now the total volume is high enough.
Got it.
That one could argue that there could still be some type of a hypertrophy response. So that's why I was saying earlier that intensity rep and volume sets are closely related, because both combined together can lead to a certain training effect.
Volume. Got it.
Now, beyond that, there's the tempo. So tempo is probably the one parameter that you see. I mean, I still see coaches paying zero attention to it, but what it does is the tempo dictates the time under tension of the set, which also dictates the training response, especially more so on a metabolic perspective. So if you're doing 10 reps, which means it should help with hypertrophy, but you're doing 12 reps in 5 seconds, your load is not under stress as long as if you're doing 10 reps on a 5010 tempo, where now you're under stress for 60 seconds. Of course, the load will be less with a 5010 tempo, but the stress is so much longer. There's way more metabolic activation or metabolic changes occurring because of that. So that's a very important parameter.
And a lot of people don't know of tempo at all. Some people know more, like you had said early on, it was a 3-digit tempo. You mentioned a 4-digit tempo, just for people that may have never heard of that. Would you explain that?
Yeah, so there's some debate on this, but in my understanding, like Ian King from Brisbane, Australia, was the first one to come up with the tempo, and it was the 3-digit tempo. Then later on, Charles did the 4-digit tempo, which made more sense because there's 4 parts to a contraction. So I'm going to talk about the 4-digit tempo. So the first number is always the eccentric contraction. So if you're doing a squat, it means going down. So you stand up, you have the barbell on your back. So let's say I'm saying a 5010 tempo. It means you're going down eccentrically in 5 seconds. In the bottom position, the transition between eccentric and concentric, 0 seconds. The third number, 1, that's the concentric, you go up in 1. The fourth number, the transition between concentric and eccentric, that would be a 0. So it means that every rep takes 6 seconds to complete, times 10 reps, that's 60 seconds. So 1 minute, which is a long time, which is also a time that's long enough to start really accumulating lactate, which is also, hormonally speaking, a good byproduct of body composition.
Got it. Got it. And, we mentioned, exercise selection, sets, reps, tempo, time under tension. Anything else that's vital, or what would you say of the different variables are the most overlooked variables by the general population and even a lot of trainers?
Well, I think there's one we haven't talked about yet that's often overlooked, and then the tempo. So tempo is one for sure. Mm-hmm. Then the other one that I think is overlooked is rest period.
Yep.
This one, too many people fall into the trap of going nonstop. But the problem with that is you're failing to understand that the central nervous system needs 5 to 6 times longer to recover than the metabolic system. And the problem is, especially if you're entry-level trainee, is if you always go nonstop with 10 seconds break in between each set, is the trainee will never truly learn intra and intermuscular coordination, which is crucial to the training effect. So what that means, intramuscular coordination is the ability of your brain to recruit the motor units within a specific muscle to lift a weight. Intermuscular coordination is the ability of your brain to recruit different muscles in a motor pattern to lift a weight through a movement. So let's say a bench press, you need the intermuscular coordination of the pecs, the lats, the triceps, the biceps, all together in order to move the weight. So what happens is a lot of entry-level trainees, especially people that have never done any type of activities in the past, they tend to have a very low threshold of motor unit recruitment. They're not recruiting a lot of motor units. That's why they're benching the barbell and they're shaking and they're struggling. So if you're always doing fast-paced workouts, cool, you're going to sweat, but you're not learning that. So your ability to get stronger and lift more load that can in the future potentially help you to lose more fat, for example, or build more mass will be jeopardized because of that lack of improvement in intra and intermuscular coordination.
Wow, that's great. Great information. You know, I'd love to dive into there's so many different ways out there, to obviously put these things together. That's kind of, would you mind talking about what some of your favorite, program schemes are and explaining kind of the variables within them, and focusing on a weight loss general population goal?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one
Yeah.
because general population to me, I have like three categories of Gen Pop.
Hmm.
And that's what I always tell my students. If you agree with me that a NFL wide receiver is athletic population, and you as a trainer, a 25-year-old trainer, you've been lifting for 7 years and you're fairly strong, but you're not crazy strong, crazy powerful, crazy athletic. Are you telling me that you're athletic population? No, you're not. If you think so, you've never seen a high-level NFL wide receiver train, and now their central nervous system kicks in. So if you're not the athletic population, then what are you? You're Gen Pop. You're just a more advanced Gen Pop. So
Yeah.
then you have that kind of Gen Pop, right? Then you have the Gen Pop that is just undertrained, hasn't done anything in years, that's kind of like getting back into it.
Mhm.
And then you have the other Gen Pop that are the entry level and or injured rehab, prehab type of clients. So of course, these three subdivisions will need to be treated differently,
Yeah.
although they're all Gen Pop, right? So for me, if I get a rehab or completely untrained person that wants fat loss, my intervention as a coach will be more on the lifestyle / nutrition in order to lose fat initially, because the training, there's just so much I can do.
Mhm.
It's not like I'm going to do a 500 calorie burning session with that person. They're not there yet. And I
Yeah.
don't like to skip steps. So I'd rather use a more standard, simplified training approach where it's going to be a little bit more single joint isolation, heavy in terms of exercise selection and programming,
Mhm.
slightly lower intensity just to get them going. But then if you have the person that's been training, that's not truly injured, that really wants to lose fat, for example, then I really like to hammer them more with something like that Charles made super popular, the German body composition training, which is basically theory took from the German that he adapted to the North American way of life, if you want. So basically, you're alternating lower body exercises with upper body exercises and double station supersets with about 10, 12 reps with incomplete recovery, like 30 seconds to 60 seconds. And what happens is, as you're doing your lower body and fatiguing the lower body, then you take your break, go to the upper body. So the lower body gets to recover a little bit, and you go back to lower body. So it allows you to have a higher average load to create a higher average output from the lifter while burning a decent amount of energy. while building some strength if you haven't been training for a while.
Yep.
But it's really more a body comp type workout. But this approach really doesn't work with the untrained or the injured population because their motor unit activation threshold is too low, and they're not going to use a lot of weight. Because I talk to students that do that a lot, and they're always, Steph, I don't get it. I write the program, it looks great. I tried it, I almost puked halfway. I gave it to Mrs. Jones, and nothing happened. She's not even sweating. Well, that's why. If she's recruiting 10% of her motor units on a 45-pound squat, how long does it take to recover 10% of the motor units she used to lift 45 pounds on her squat? Nothing. Yeah. So that's why she can recover fast. That's why she doesn't sweat. But if you're doing this, you're recruiting 60% of your motor units. So now all of this needs to recover. There's so much more involved. That's why you're sweating. That's why you're out of breath. So you need to get these clients to get to that level before these types of workouts become effective.
That's great. Well, do you use, and I know there's another variable, training age, of just really kind of, not necessarily a variable, but more of something that dictates what you're saying. Is that the sole thing that really that you use that dictates kind of what bucket they're in? I mean, obviously take out high-end athlete, but just in those beginning years, would you explain what training age is?
Yeah, so training age is typically the way I look at it. If you have 0 to 1 year of training age, you're classified as a beginner. If you have 2 to 3, you're intermediate. If you have 4 or more, you're advanced. But the problem is I always kind of calculate the training age based off of training with someone or a coach that I know the style of training they're doing. For example, if the person has 10 years of training age, but for 10 years, all they've been doing is that 10-pound kettlebell 4 times a week for 10 years, that's all they've been doing, that doesn't count for 10 years. For me, they come to me, they're at 0.
Got it.
Okay? They're a new beginner. So it kind of has to fit a little bit with what you as a coach you're promoting or you're designing for your clients.
Got it. And within that same kind of concept is, if let's say somebody's worked with a good, did some good programming, they've been doing it 5-6 years, and then they take a year off or even 6 months off, or what is the time off? And then when they come back, where do you put them into?
Yeah, that's another tough one because it depends on how long you've been training. So if you've been training for 15 years and you take a year off, you're not going to be as far back as if you've been training for a year and take a year off. So if you've been training a year, you take a year off, you're basically starting back at 0. If you've been training for 8+ years and you take a year off, maybe we're going to shed like a year, maybe 2 years from your experience, and then we can start from there. Because there's like that concept called like muscle memory and stuff like that kind of kicks in. The person who's been training for that long won't lose as much muscle mass during the process, and on and on.
Got it. Well, I'm excited because I know for those out there that are loving this, we're going to do a series and keep evolving this thing. So there's some things that structural balance and different things that we're going to get into. We'll save that for later. But what I want to end with, today is more, you've obviously learned a ton from all these different people, and now you started, Kilo Strength Society, and I know that you've evolved this information, and, we've talked offline about how that, what you were doing. Would you mind just, in the time that we have, explaining how you've been able to evolve it, how you've been able to actually make it a little bit more easier to apply, and kind of what, how you've been able to do that?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I learned through continuing education was very geared towards elite professional athletes, Olympic style athletes. But like you said earlier, training athletes is good, but you really generate income training the general population. So I wanted, and when we started Kilo, what I wanted to do is take some of the knowledge that I use to train athletes, but format it or present it in a way that the general population could actually have success with. Okay, because to me, at the end of the day, we're all athletes up to a certain point, It's more the extent at which you're going to push the training that's going to differentiate. So, like I manipulated the periodization, made it a little bit more, less abstract, less subjective, a little bit more structured in his approach. The program design, but everything was kind of geared to like be a little bit more in tune with the general population. So they're still doing challenging stuff, but at their level. And then what we also do is, if you can do something, because you have different approaches, like you have somebody who can't squat, for example. Their approach is, okay, you can squat. They start all the way down to the first progression. They build back up. But my approach, which evolved over the years, is more, okay, you can do a squat, but can you do the first regression below squat? No, you can't. The other one. You can't. The other one. Oh, you can do this? Good. And then we start from there instead of rewinding all the way back to step one to build back up. So that was a big part of our approach.
So you've been able to actually step by step not only figure out, everybody says you should squat and you should deadlift and you should push and you should pull, and but you've been able to actually kind of take that system and figure out where does your client specifically fit in kind of a step-by-step approach, correct? Is that what I'm hearing? Beautiful.
But I believe everybody should, but it doesn't mean everybody can.
Yeah.
Or that they can right now. So that's why I feel like a progressive or regressive approach, if you want.
Beautiful.
Yeah, there's a smarter way.
Well, and I think that's a huge thing too. What you just said there is so many trainers and so many people know how to regress, but they don't think know how to progress, but they forget how to regress. Or the regression is just such. It goes from, you can't squat. Okay, let's go do a leg extension or a leg press. And it's just like, okay, there's a hell of a lot in between those two that we can work on. That's awesome. Well, Stephane, I can't thank you enough. I wanted to start here with just some fundamental stuff, for the audience out there. But, what I always say is just because I say the word or we say the word fundamental does not mean it's easy and does not mean that it isn't ridiculously valuable. Because if you take just some of the things that Stephane has gone through today and apply those, God, the results in the different impact that you'll feel and see long term is going to happen. So I can't thank you enough for that. And obviously for really in-depth education, you want to visit kilostrengthsociety.com. I'll have the notes I'll have the link in the notes, so you can go there, and we're going to talk about his live courses and his virtual courses and books that he's written and things like that. That's all there, and we'll talk about that in future episodes. So I can't thank you enough, and look forward to more of a partnership, and you helping out all the trainers in the world, obviously the ones at Lifetime as well, with your information. So thanks again, and really appreciate all you've done for the industry, man.
Thank you. You're welcome.